Hello YouTube, welcome to my channel. I'm Bella and today I'm going to be reviewing the movie Mary Queen of Scots. I know, there's so much to unpack in this, but first things first. I just want to say that the two leads in this, the performances are very good. So that's in the good column. Another thing that's in the good column is actually the relationship between Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley. That is wonderfully and well portrayed, and it contrasts so well with the relationship that poor Mary, the Queen of Scots, not Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's sister, but Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, Queen of Scotland, has with Lord Darnley and her second husband. And they did that really well. And actually, Elizabeth I's relationship with William Cecil was dealt really well. Though I do question the fact that William Cecil being classed as her wife. No, he wasn't. He was her first minister, Lord Burleigh was. And she couldn't have reigned without him. In fact, she couldn't have reigned without Francis Walsingham, Master of Spies, Robert Dudley, Master of the Horse, and also her eyes. He had to attend literally every meeting at one point during her reign because she wouldn't let him leave her side. Literally, it was her suite of rooms, this is Elizabeth I, her suite of rooms, and next door was Robert Dudley. He was literally her eyes and ears around the court. She relied on his honest reports. He was a very good politician. Once he got over wanting to be king and being ambitious, which is one of the reasons why Elizabeth offered him as a suitor for Mary Queen of Scots, and Robert Dudley was like, no, she's not going to take me, dear. She's not going to take me because she knows I'm into you. And she's like, yes, but she's pretty. It might work. Oh, Mary should have married Robert Dudley. And then had to deal with the hell beast that Elizabeth I would have become. So looking back, maybe it was for the best that Mary Queen of Scots didn't marry him. But Mary Queen of Scots, her story is completely tragic. To be absolutely honest, she should have married after the Dauphin of France sadly died, and she should have married some of her other suitors, because it's very clear that her half-brother, who was one of her, who was an illegitimate son of her father, the former King of Scotland, because he had 9 at least illegitimate children, and the one that's featured as the main brother is actually the son of her father's favourite mistress, and he was reigning as regent whilst Mary was married in France. So Scotland got used to having a regent, and it's quite interesting to note that kings and queens in Scotland weren't reverenced like they were in England, so they didn't do the whole Your Majesty thing. It just didn't happen. I was pleased to see that Mary Queen of Scots in this did speak French and a little bit of Italian, because obviously those are the languages she would need on the continent, and being the Queen of France, which is what she was being groomed to be. Unfortunately, her husband died when he was young, so that didn't happen. But what is interesting is they gave her a Scottish accent, which we don't know if that would be accurate or not. I can't say. I don't think it probably would be. There were several other things that were possibly queried, like the whole diversity thing. Yes, in the UK we have had black and Asian people since the ancient Roman times. They got brought over by the Romans as slaves and possibly merchants. That is nothing new. Would they be at court? Very possibly they would be at court as like showpieces. Would they actually be a lord or a lady wielding power? It's possible, but is it likely? Who knows? We can't say, because there are so few depictions of people of different ethnicities in positions in power. It's difficult, and you have to get the facts right, so we don't know. So there's a big question over that use, but I understand and respect why the makers of this film felt that needed to be there, and it's interesting because it then casts doubt over the negotiations with Scotland. But would you really want that inferred? I don't know. It's Elizabethan England. Things are dodgy anyway. But it was nice to actually, what was really good about this, we've got good portrayals by both actresses, good representation of the relationship between Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley, excellent. Good the fact that they used the relationship between Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I to contrast the appalling relationships that Mary Queen of Scots had with her two husbands, particularly Lord Darnley. He was odd. It was all odd. I don't know what it is about odd, but I mean, who nearly dies getting themselves blown up and then gets murdered whilst fleeing in the garden? It's just dodgy. The whole history of Mary, as soon as she sets foot in Scotland, it just becomes like, you can't really make it up. It's just awful what happens to her. But her biggest mistake, and it is a mistake, is when she left James. As long as she had her son with her, she was safe. As soon as she left him with her illegitimate half-brother and left, she effectively no longer governed as queen. She set herself up. You do not separate yourself from the heir. That is something you don't do. You always keep your heir very close to you, and it's something that Henry VIII does with all of his 3 children. If you notice, as soon as his children become of age, what he does is he then removes them from court and gives them their own household, so that they are then, from a very early age, in charge of whole groups of people. But he also invites them to court periodically. He doesn't keep them at court because it's dangerous for them to be there, but he then invites them. Obviously, once Lady Mary or Princess Mary gets to sort of 15, she's there more often because she needs to learn how to navigate court as a courtier. It's part of her role, even if she's still classed as illegitimate. But he all sorts that out. But it's interesting that with his final wife, Henry VIII gets all 3 of his kids close to him all the time because he's elderly, and the reason he has his children close to him is he is showing people, don't worry about my ill health, we've got 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to spell it out for you in the different acts of succession and his will. And that will stood. That will stood, because people were like, oh, we can see where we're going. Henry VIII, then Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. That's what people liked about that. As soon as Mary Queen of Scots left James, she set herself up to be raped, to be brutalised for whatever reason. As long as she had James with her, she couldn't be touched because you had the Queen and you had the heir. As soon as she left him, I was like, oh, Mary, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And then, see, the thing is because her brother was used to regenting, he's used to being a regent, a Lord Protector, because unfortunately women weren't seen as capable. The only reason Elizabeth had all the power and all the authority was because her father spelled it out in his will. He said it's going to be Edward first, then Mary, then Elizabeth. That's how I've done it. You know how I've educated my children. They know what to do. You will trust them. And even when we had the 9-day Queen, Lady Jane Grey, it still reverted back to Mary because people wanted a Tudor. They were like, no, we want Henry VIII's daughter because she has got the better claim to the throne, even though she's a Catholic. Yeah, the British people are very strange. They were like, no, we know the contents of Henry VIII's will. We want these 3 people. End of discussion. And what the people want, the people get. Unfortunately, Mary Queen of Scots, as soon as she left James, terrible, terrible disaster. But it was good that this film showed the fact that Elizabeth was also supporting the illegitimate male son. And I found that interesting. But then again, he was used to power and Elizabeth was used to working with him. As soon as Mary arrived, it caused chaos. But it's what I really, so we've got good portrayals from the actresses, good contrasting relationship between Elizabeth Dudley and, not Elizabeth Dudley, between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley and Mary Queen of Scots and her husband's, how awful it was. And we've also got, which is my 3rd point that I want to make, we've got an excellent, excellent contrast between what it was like to live in Scotland and what it was like to live in England. The fact that they were 2 very different countries, they were governed very differently. And also you saw how, unfortunately, John Knox took against Mary Queen of Scots, even though she was Catholic. But it was more than that, it was she couldn't appreciate the Protestantism within her own country, and that is a huge factor because Elizabeth is a Protestant queen. Yes, she said, I've no desire to make windows into men's souls. If people are Catholic, that's fine, that's their business, but they will serve England first and they will serve me. And it's interesting that Frances Wolsey and Robert Dudley and William Cecil were her dogs, and they wore her collars, and she had them on leashes. Yes, she used them for what she wanted, but she was very much in control of those. And that's one of the bad things that I dislike about this film, is it made Elizabeth feel that her ministers were controlling her when it actually wasn't. She was very much in charge. She knew what she was doing. Yes, she never said that James was going to be king afterwards, but she knew that he would be. She knew that that was the plan, because that was the plan all along. That's why Henry VII, Henry VIII's dad, sent his daughter up to Scotland to eventually unite Scotland and England, because we're always better united. So yes, it did a good job of showing the difference between England and Scotland. Did a good job of the two lead actresses' portrayal. They were very, very good. Unfortunately, the Scottish accent wasn't. The relationship between Robert Dudley and Elizabeth was done well, and it was a great contrast to the unfortunate relationships that Mary Queen of Scots has as soon as she set foot in Scotland. It's interesting that Elizabeth would support the illegitimate regent, but then again, she was used to working with him whilst Mary was away, because you got to remember, when Mary was born, she was an infant. She got sent to France as an infant. When she returned to Scotland, she still thought Catholicism was big. It wasn't. She couldn't appreciate the changes that had happened in England and in Scotland. Had she done so, she would have conducted herself differently. But then again, how could she have? She was raised in France, and France was a Catholic country with an absolute monarch. She just couldn't get her head around it. Not to say that she was incompetent, because she was younger than Elizabeth. She was young. She wasn't incompetent. She just didn't understand, because she'd never had to rule for herself, because she was being educated in France. She came back age 19. Elizabeth had survived her father and her two siblings that squabbled all the time, and Mary wanted to chop off her head. Literally, she had the death warrant, and the only thing that stopped her signing the death warrant was because Elizabeth was her sister. And that's one of the reasons why Elizabeth didn't want to sign Mary Queen of Scots' death warrant, because she was her cousin. But the big problem was Mary Queen of Scots had abandoned the heir, and her half-brother, who was illegitimate, was a better ruler. And yes, Elizabeth could keep her safe for 8 years, but there was no way that she was ever going to get Scotland's, rule on the Scottish throne. And when you've got a regent protector there doing a good job, nor was she ever going to take Elizabeth's throne. She was a pawn piece that was used. Had she stayed in France and married somebody from Portugal, some of the other suitors, whole different story. But then again, England would have had a completely different heir then, after Elizabeth I, and probably it would have actually forced Elizabeth and Robert Dudley to marry if Mary Queen of Scots married somebody else, but she didn't. She came back and wanted to solve the problems there. So, on the whole, the film was okay. The costumes were good, apart from the earrings. I know people have complained about the earrings. The portrayals are good. I do have to say that. Yeah, this is it. It's 15. Yep, that is a fair rating, because, Mary Queen of Scots' story isn't a pleasant one. She gets raped, and her ladies-in-waiting are just useless. I don't know what it is. They just wait outside, whereas you can see, what I really liked was actually the understanding of the ladies-in-waiting and their use. You can see, whereas Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting was so loyal that they were able to sort of clear the whole room where all the men were playing tennis, get out, get out, get out, and they sort of said, no, you've got to stay, Robert, she wants to speak to you, and they cleared it, and they shut all the doors, and they allowed that relationship to take place. Whereas Mary Queen of Scots, ladies-in-waiting, they didn't go in and defend her, they waited outside, they didn't they weren't present, and that's something that Elizabeth learnt very early on. She wrote a letter to her sister, and at the bottom there was space, and she drew lines on the bottom of it so nobody could add anything to it. And it's very much how Elizabeth used her ladies-in-waiting. She always had her ladies-in-waiting with her when she was with Robert, because people could say, oh, nothing happened, I was there. Or even when they were together, they were fully clothed, and her ladies could say, I saw him go in, they were just in their undergarments, it was fine. Nothing happened. We didn't hear a noise, because remember, ladies-in-waiting slept in her room. Yeah. Because Elizabeth isn't silly. Because Elizabeth understood the value of her chastity. She knew that she was the state. Unfortunately, Mary Queen of Scots didn't have that understanding. But it's interesting again, is Robert Dudley's dad has had his head chopped off as a traitor. Elizabeth I's mother had her head chopped off. And that's interesting. Anyway, enough about them. We're supposed to be talking about Mary Queen of Scots. Every time I come across Mary Queen of Scots, I groan inwardly like, oh, why? It's just so tragic. She just couldn't get a grasp of it, and it does well. I mean, it shows her strength as like a leader, the fact that she wouldn't murder her first husband when her counsellors advising her to do so. Had she gone with them, it probably wouldn't have looked so bad. It did show her leading armies. Yes, she did do that. What I would have liked to have seen is, I would have liked to have seen, there's when the Spanish Armada is attacking England, Elizabeth and Robert, Elizabeth is on a horse, Robert is leading her on a horse, though before that he's riding behind her to show that she's the queen and I'm the subject, and then he gets off his horse and leads her like the good subject he is. I would have liked to have seen that contrast with how it was interesting, because they had Mary at first leading her army, and then you had Lord Darnley then slowly sort of ride behind her, next to her, and in front of her, and that's interesting. I would have liked to see a little bit more contrast of that done, but obviously they've got to stick to time periods, even though some of this is a little woolly, and you know, you're never going to get 100% accurateness with the historical drama these days. I mean, the Tudors, the Tudors TV series was 95% accurate. No, it wasn't 95, it was 85%, sorry. And then you had the Elizabeth, and then Elizabeth the Golden Age films, and they weren't as accurate as I would have liked. They treated Robert Dudley something horrid, to be absolutely honest, whereas since the 1960s, historians have really looked into Robert Dudley and actually said he wasn't just her lover slash pretty boy. He was actually an important politician within his own right. Just that his relationship with Elizabeth was more intimate because he'd known her for such a long time. I mean, they were childhood friends from the age of 8. So he knew there are certain things, and it's interesting that when it came to signing Mary's Queen of Scots death warrant, Elizabeth did actually fret. She did take her time over it. She didn't just sign it like she does here in front of ministers. She actually signed it in her bedroom, and the only person that we think was there was Robert Dudley, who actually said to her, one of the biggest things that you have that makes you different from Mary Queen of Scots is you've always put your head, you've always put the body politic ahead of your personal needs. Even though at one point there was a time when we could have married, you knew that had we done so, the whole country would have been in ruin. If you don't sign this warrant, if you shrink from it, you risk the accusation that people say, oh, you're similar. You won't. And that's interesting in itself, because Mary Queen of Scots, unfortunately, she made herself redundant. I did like the scene where you had the Tudor rose burning, though. She made like the rose out of paper and she was talking about it, and like people couldn't understand why she was talking about that's Elizabeth I. And she burnt it, and I found that really, really interesting, because it was the Tudor rose that was burning, because there won't be any more Tudor heirs, they will all be Stuart. Though that's not strictly accurate either, because Mary Queen of Scots is what? The daughter of Henry VIII's sister. So it's a cousin, really. So technically the Stuarts were actually Tudor Stuarts, if you really want to get that technical. Anyway, moving swiftly on, it was an okay movie. Yes, there was issues with things historically, but Mary Queen of Scots' history is such a mess that you just sort of look at it and go, oh my God, it's a car crash. It literally is a car crash. The poor woman just sort of like kamikazes into disasters of her own making, and you just sort of think, oh, please. And then you just sort of see Elizabeth go, I don't have to do anything, I just have to wait for her to make errors. And that's pretty much what she does. I mean, yeah, what was nice about this is the fact that you had their letters between Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth I of England, and the letters between Mary Queen of Scots. You heard their words to each other, which were very nice, because you could see that they had some family relations then were in the letters, and you could see that they actually were speaking of that, because you've got to remember that Mary Queen of Scots is one of the few people that Elizabeth I is actually related to, besides her legitimate half-brothers and sisters. That's Mary Queen of Scots, half-brothers and sisters, and obviously James. So these are her family members. Though it does mean that you can say that Elizabeth I is like Henry VIII chopping off heads, I guess. So yeah, overall I'm going to give this film a 4. Maybe, no, I'm going to change it to 3.5. No, 3.75, I think. It did a good job. Mary Queen of Scots' story is so awful that actually you just want to hang out with Elizabeth I, because you know that she's in charge. Yeah, it was just awful. Really, really awful. It's like she shouldn't have returned to Scotland. Or at least she should have written ahead and asked how things were. And tell me the news of Scotland, oh brother, before I come and claim my throne there and depose you, which then puts you in an awkward situation because you've been working so closely with the English. Yeah. So that's basically this. Do check it out. It is an interesting movie. Yes, there are some historical inaccuracies, but you're going to get that with historical movies these days. Hope you've enjoyed this review. Please like, comment and subscribe, and thank you for your support. Bye!